Morning, everybody. That's just a couple of disclaimers for you. So I'm going to talk about the use of biosimilars in supportive care, and we've got three. We've got epoetin, filgrastim, and infliximab, which is an anti-TNF monoclonal antibody that we use in the treatment of immune-related colitis secondary to checkpoint inhibitors. I'm going to focus on the second two, because in the UK, although EPO actually was the first biosimilar approved, it wasn't actually commissioned for use in cancer-related anemia at the beginning, and so by the time we started using it, it had already been implemented elsewhere. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of our experience in the UK of implementing biosimilars, and then later on I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing at ISOO, which is the International Society of Oncology Pharmacy Practitioners, in supporting pharmacists around the world in implementing biosimilars where they are. So filgrastim was our very first biosimilar that we used in oncology. We were very careful and cautious when we were first implementing it. We reviewed every scrap of literature that we could find before we implemented. We were encouraged by our national commissioning bodies, who are always after us to save money for the National Health Service. And also we were helped by a regional tendering process. So we do this when we introduce any new drugs, and the idea is that it will help bring down the price of the originator as well. And each region will choose whichever project, whatever project turns out to be the most cost-effective for them. Locally, our Drugs and Therapeutics Committee and our local chemotherapy group had a good look at the evidence before we made our decision, and we did training and education for all of our staff and patients to make sure everyone was ready and everyone was engaged and we were all happy with the change. And the impact is, well, we know that the introduction of biosimilar medicines has been shown to increase access to treatment. And certainly following the introduction of biosimilar filgrastim in the UK, the usage in London alone increased by 40%. So where previously we'd been quite restricted in the regimes that we were using filgrastim for, because of the lower acquisition price, we felt that we were able to extend it to some of the others so that more patients could benefit. But in spite of that increased use, we still delivered significant budget savings. So in London alone, we saved £1 million per year as a result of that switchover. And that effect was replicated across Europe. So all of the countries that implemented the biosimilar filgrastim saw a jump in the use, with a quite impressive five-fold increase in Sweden, and estimated cost savings of 85 million euros per year across Europe. Now, fast forward 10, 11 years, and where are we now with filgrastim in the UK? So now we're very, very comfortable with it. We switch freely between brands depending on our regional procurement contracts. And the way that we do these contracts is the different regions will collaborate with each other, so that we don't all pick the same product and we keep a healthy competition in the market. We wouldn't want to just all pick the same brand and risk putting somebody out of business, because we want to keep the prices low. So we've made significant cost savings. The price of the biosimilar filgrastim these days is about a fifth of what the cost of the originator once was, and the prices of the originator have come down as well. We prescribe generically, and pharmacy will supply whatever the current preferred brand is. And in fact, actually, if you ask any of our prescribers at the Royal Marsden where I work, I don't think they even know what brand that we use. They just happily accept that they prescribe filgrastim, and we'll supply the current product of choice. There are pockets of practice where the innovator is still used. So, for example, in paediatrics, one of the problems is that the biosimilar products come in pre-filled syringes at adult doses. So in order to get a paediatric dose, they need to use the vial, and the only vial we have available is Neupogen brand. Although our paediatrics team at the Royal Marsden are looking now at using the biosimilar pegylated product, with the advantage that the children only then have to have one injection. And in the UK, we're not really allowed to use the pegylated branded version because it's a lot more expensive than the biosimilar. So again, this is going to increase access to a single injection for the children, which is great. Also, the other area where we see originators used is in stem cell mobilization for transplants. And the reason for that was when we very first introduced them, there wasn't so much data available in this setting. People are a little cautious because it's a curative setting that they perhaps wanted to stick with the originator. That practice is now starting to change as people have got very confident with the biosimilars. But a lot of them had lenograstim in their protocols and are now going to have to switch to filgrastim before they switch to the biosimilar. But it's starting to happen now. So what data do we have to back up this practice? Well, there is a lot of real-world data now because it's been 10 years since we implemented these drugs. So we have two very big real-world studies. We have NEXT, which looked at 2,000 patients receiving Navestim, and Monitor GCSF, which looked at over 1,400 patients on Zarzio. And these patients were on a variety of different chemotherapy regimes, both hematology and solid tumor oncology. And it demonstrated that rates of neutropenia, febrile neutropenia, dose delays and reductions, as well as the incidence of adverse reactions, were consistent with those reported for the originator products. And in the area where we once worried, the stem cell mobilization, a pooled analysis of 12 autologous and 5 allogeneic healthy donor biosimilar cell mobilization studies showed no significant differences between the biosimilar versus the originator GCSF in the median number of cells mobilized or in the number of injections and leukapheresis processes required to harvest the target cell dose. There is a larger 10-year follow-up study underway of 242 healthy volunteer donors, and to date, there's no concerns with efficacy or safety, and in none of these studies have there been any worries about induced immunity in patients. So as far as switching brands goes, the Pioneer trial involved around 250 patients having TAC chemotherapy for breast cancer, which is quite a myelosuppressive regime. And there were 4 arms. One arm received biosimilar, one arm received the originator, and the other 2 arms switched back and forth between the two with each cycle. And that repeated switching didn't impact efficacy, safety, or immunogenicity. So implying that it's quite safe to switch between brands for patients. So moving on to infliximab. So this was our first monoclonal antibody biosimilar that we've used in the UK. And initially the evidence came from these 2 studies, Planetra and Planetas, which demonstrated efficacy in rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis. Initially, there were some fears about extrapolating into the indication for inflammatory bowel disease, but they were allayed by this trial called the Northwich trial. So Northwich took 482 patients who were previously stable on the originator Remicade for at least 6 months, and that could be for any indication, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, rheumatology, or even dermatology. And those patients were randomized to either continue on the originator or switch to a biosimilar in a double-blind fashion. And after 52 weeks of follow-up, the biosimilar demonstrated non-inferiority in terms of worsening of disease and frequency of adverse effects. And that was enough for our commissioning body, NHS England, to issue a guideline saying that they encouraged everybody to switch to the biosimilar to realise cost savings. And NICE, who is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence in the UK, who provide our clinical guidelines, they updated their guidelines to include biosimilar as a choice of treatment for all of the NICE-approved indications. The British Gastroenterology Society advocated the use of the biosimilar infliximab in inflammatory bowel disease, but stipulated that it had to be brand name prescribing and that automatic substitution wasn't allowed. And it was around this time that actually the use of checkpoint inhibitors in the UK was really taking off. And on the back of this work in inflammatory bowel disease, we then adopted the biosimilar for the treatment of immune-related colitis in an off-label way. And as a result of the implementation of biosimilar infliximab, the NHS saved 99 million in the year 2017-2018 across all of the indications. It was quite a slow implementation. It took about 3 years to reach 90% uptake, largely due to those initial concerns about extrapolating into gastroenterology. But at the moment, we're over 90% usage is biosimilar. Oh, sorry, I'm flicking backwards and forwards. So we've had a very positive experience of implementation of biosimilars in the UK. We've had no problems, and we've realised a lot of cost savings for the National Health Service. So when ISOO were looking for somebody to chair their biosimilar task force, I was quite keen to volunteer to support other pharmacists to implement in their own locations. And part of that work was to look at implementation practices across the world. And we sent out a survey to all of the ISOO members and encouraged ISOO members to share the survey with their national oncology pharmacy associations. We had 90 survey responses, and those responses represented 27 different countries across 6 continents, with the greatest number of responses coming from Japan, Brazil, Australia, and Canada, although we had responses from various European countries and from as far afield as Sudan, Qatar, Ghana, and Nigeria. The majority of participants worked in hospitals of various types, with 19% working in outpatient settings. And we asked the pharmacists which biosimilar products were currently available in the country where they practiced. And you can see that around 87% of pharmacists reported that they had access to filgrastim, which is really encouraging, and probably largely due to the fact that in 2015, filgrastim was added to the WHO essential medicines list, which I'm sure has helped with availability. Infliximab is also available in quite a lot of places, followed by rituximab and trastuzumab. The countries where no biosimilars were available, the respondents came from Qatar and Turkey. Although interestingly enough, we had 3 respondents from Turkey, 1 who said there were no biosimilars available at all, and 2 said that there were, which really reflects that there is a lot of intra-country variability for availability of various biosimilars. We also had a respondent from Malaysia who pointed out that although the biosimilars theoretically were available, they'd yet to see any come into clinical practice. And we also had respondents from the US pointing out that although there was now an FDA license for the trastuzumab, that they were yet to have any availability in clinical practice. So availability is only part of the picture when it comes to implementation. So 66% of our respondents had regulatory pathways for the introduction of biosimilars to their national pharmaceutical market. And they identified 20 different licensing agencies responsible for regulating use. 5% had no licensing agency. There were lots of people that didn't really know or understand the pathway in their country, which is possibly highlights an education need there. In the majority of cases, the final decision on whether a biosimilar was implemented in a particular institution came down to that institution's Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, which explains a lot of the variability in practice within individual countries. And the main influence on that decision, 92% of people replied that it was cost, over and above evidence and over and above even availability. And as you can see here, around 60% of respondents indicated that there was partial implementation of biosimilars at their institution. And when asked what the reasons for those were, it was a lack of data in particular settings, for example, in pediatrics or in stem cell transplantation, sort of indicating a reluctance to extrapolate between indications. And in some places, for example, Canada, their biosimilars were only approved for limited indications. In some places, they reported that clinicians were more accepting of biosimilars in non-cancer indications and also in supportive care, and were a little bit more fearful of implementing in the treatment setting. And also, available routes of administration were important. So, for example, if you have the possibility of using subcut trastuzumab in your setting, you may be less inclined to move back to using intravenous in order to access the cost savings of a biosimilar. And in general, barriers to implementation of biosimilars were a reluctance to swap established patients to a biosimilar. Reluctance of prescribers to use biosimilars came from pretty much everywhere. So we've still got a lot of work to do in educating people and in what the evidence is that biosimilars are equivalent. Insurance adaptation and payer preferences. So in the US and Australia, a lot of pharmacists find themselves restricted by what insurance companies or other payers will actually pay for. And some were saying that because different companies might prefer a different product, in order to please everyone, they might have to keep some of each brand in stock, which isn't the best way to do it. Mm-hmm. In Kenya, they reported a lack of regulatory pathways as a barrier, and in Ghana, sourcing and quality of products was an issue. And worryingly, 70% of the pharmacists couldn't describe their pharmacovigilance mechanisms in their country, which again highlights perhaps an educational need or perhaps a lack of those mechanisms. So overall, I think our study showed that there was a lot to be done to support pharmacists in implementation, and guidelines and position statements are really important in helping with that, which Harbans is going to talk about in a minute. There are things that can be done to really accelerate the uptake of biosimilars. And I just want to show you this slide from the UK, from National NHS England, which shows the time it takes to reach 90% implementation. So the blue line here is the, it's purple. No, it's blue. The blue line here shows the implementation levels of infliximab as time went on from implementation, gradually increasing to 90% over a period of 3 years. In 2017, NHS England introduced this commissioning framework, which incentivized institutions to uptake biosimilars more quickly. And you can see that when we introduced biosimilar rituximab, it only took a year to reach 90% implementation. And when we recently introduced biosimilar trastuzumab, it only took us 9 months for all of the NHS trusts to reach 90% implementation. And one of the things that actually slowed that down wasn't anything to do with the institution's resistance to change. It was a lack of stability data for compounded products that we were waiting for before we'd all switch over. And that commissioning framework included a Vanguard project where lead hospitals took the lead, led on a stakeholder engagement, got everyone on board, including patient groups, including professional groups, and produced a toolkit of resources, including patient information leaflets, checklists for implementation, timelines to follow, so that all of the smaller hospitals could follow on in our footsteps. Okay. We also have national guidelines, and the key thing was financial incentives. So the hospitals were given financial targets to implement within a certain time frame. And just finally, to finish, it's gone so well that in 2017 we were predicting a 200 to 300 million pounds a year saving by 2021. And now the most updated version of the framework is predicting a 400 to 500 million cost saving by 2021. So we're feeling really confident, and it's been a really positive experience. And finally, I just wanted to say a big thank you to our ISOO Biosimilars task force for all their hard work. Thank you.
You can sit up here, actually, because we're going to...
Thank you very much, Emma. And Now, the impossible task. I'm looking forward to this talk because I was thinking of how would I address the current guidelines on the use of biosimilars, at least in Europe. Not only every country, but every region in every country has its own opinion. So, Habens Dylan from Malaysia.
Thank you. So this is my disclosure, not very much. So we're just going to have a brief discussion about the uptake of biosimilars, the countries that have biosimilar guidelines, and the various guidelines that are available currently. So with the emergence of biosimilars, guidelines are really needed to ensure that these group of drugs are used properly. So the uptake really depends on quite a number of factors and strategies, and some of them, of course, are patent protection, regulatory requirements in different countries, health technology assessment, and this is a big thing, especially in Malaysia, reimbursement processes, procurement and tendering processes. If you already, like in Malaysia, if we have innovator drug on tender, we have to wait for that tender to finish before we can bring in a biosimilar to make it more cost effective. And these are some of the things that need to change in order for us to have effective cost savings. And of course, the positions in the different countries or the guidelines that are provided by the different countries regarding interchangeability, whether you can substitute or switch, as was alluded to much earlier. So this is a world map that shows countries that have biosimilar guidelines, and you can see the green ones are the ones that have it. Russia currently is on the verge of publishing their biosimilar guidelines, and those in white are the ones that do not have guidelines available to them. And this map was shown earlier, and you can see the dates on this map when these biosimilar guidelines have been implemented, and some of them have been implemented rather early, like in Malaysia in 2003. However, until today, according to the implementation survey that Emma just presented, the uptake of biosimilars is not there. I know that in the institution that I work in, we have certainly brought in biosimilars, but this is not across the country. So the uptake actually remains a major issue. Now, the WHO guidelines provide globally acceptable principles for licensing of these products. And these guidelines can be adopted partially or as a whole by the national regulatory agencies worldwide, or can be used as a basis for a framework to establish the licensure of these products. So many of the countries around the world actually do not reinvent their own guidelines, but use the WHO guidelines. And these guidelines from WHO, to harmonize it, WHO actually issued similar guidelines or the similar principles to those of the European Medicines Agency, that's EMA. So many developed countries have rigorous regulatory processes that ensure comparability of biosimilars with the reference products. And although these regulations may vary substantially across countries, many countries are striving towards the harmonization of accepted criteria by EMA, US FDA, and WHO. However, there is still a lack of uniform approach to the regulatory approval, and sad to say, in some countries, synthetic copies of branded compounds have found their way and been approved because of lack of proper education or without proper comparative clinical studies with the innovator. So if we go to the regulations in the European Union, EMA was the first region or EMA first pioneered and set up a legal framework in 2004. And the first biosimilar that was approved by the EU was in 2006. The acceptance and demands of the payers and public are increasing. And of course, we have seen over the previous speakers the amount of savings that you can have. But we estimate that in time to come, there will be billions in savings when you use biosimilars. And the EU contribution to the regulation of biosimilars is acceptable worldwide. So EMA has an overarching biosimilars guideline which outlines quality, clinical and non-clinical data, and they also supplemented with specific product guidelines. Example, they have a guideline for the biological medicinal products which have included monoclonal antibodies. And they also have published an information guide for healthcare professionals, and which summarizes the science and regulation underpinning the use of biosimilar medicines. So just to give you an example, some of the table contents of the guideline on biological medicine products that are available by EMA is executive summary, introduction, regulatory framework and the scope, the legal basis and relevant guidelines, application, choice of reference products, and the principles for establishing biosimilarity. So the information guideline the contents has overview, definitions, features, and why biosimilars are not considered generic medicines, how they develop and approve biosimilars in the EU, the safety, which often is the data that people are looking for or the physicians are looking for, and data included for prescribing and the assessment reports for biosimilars. So if you're really wondering what are the guidelines, I would actually advise you to look for the EMA guidelines because they're really very comprehensive. Now, while I was doing work for this, of course, my relationship with BOPA, which is the British Oncology Pharmacy Association, became close because of Emma, and we work on the same committee on biosimilars. So it's interesting to note that the guidelines of implementation of the monoclonal antibodies in Britain, as was earlier alluded to, is very definitive. In fact, they have a position statement on the implementation of biosimilar monoclonal antibodies. And they also define the role of the oncology pharmacists, who will contribute to medicine optimization of biosimilars, supporting the commissioning of these drugs, ensuring the physicians are engaged and informed, and the patients are appropriately educated and informed, ensuring pharmacovigilance processes are followed through, managing process of switching initially and in the future, and to ensure optimization of e-prescribing, electronic prescribing. Now, there was a systematic review published early this year, on the factors affecting healthcare provider knowledge and acceptance of biosimilar medicines, published in the Journal of Managed Care and Specialty Pharmacy. And in it, they found that the clinicians in the US and Europe are cautious about biosimilar use and do not support the use of biosimilars as safe and effective treatment options for patients who are already on or receiving the originator therapy. So there's a hesitancy that deters biosimilar prescribing and use. And one of the ways, of course, they recommend is education. And they also published in this paper that the education remains a relatively neglected area, and this is something that needs to be emphasized in future reviews. The review also identified several topics that clinician-tailored biosimilar education should address to alleviate the existing misunderstandings and bridge the knowledge gaps. Now, the major areas focused reviewing concepts of immunogenicity, extrapolation, and interchangeability. So they recommended that future research should explore different healthcare provider types in greater detail and evaluate practitioners' engagements with patients to ensure that providers can effectively communicate with their patients about biosimilars as a treatment option. So, whilst there are guidelines existing throughout most of the world, there's very little incorporation of these guidelines at national levels in some countries. I think one of the things that we have to do is to establish working groups to assist regulatory authorities in their efforts to develop and introduce biosimilars into respective countries. There is an urgent need for enhanced training of regulatory bodies and authorities on how to evaluate biosimilars, and patient information leaflets prepared at a national level to provide uniform information for patients and caregivers. I particularly feel that education programs are of great need to create trust in these products. And the other part, of course, is the pharmacovigilance, as we've heard from the previous speakers. There's no direct proper method on how to do this. I mean, an adverse event is reported, and it's the same in our hospital. When we have an adverse event, we fill up all the blue forms and send it to the ministry. And some of the reports that we get back is, yes, we are aware that these adverse events happen and they are duly documented. But I'd like to know, what are you doing about it? We are continuously reporting the adverse events, but what is the next step? And perhaps this is where the education lies, the gap lies in implementing biosimilars as well. So what are the challenges that we have? Maybe we need more crossover trials, but then again, this is costly. But I think pharmacists need more information, and pharmacists need to play a much bigger role in the Drug and Therapeutics Committee in their hospitals to ensure or to provide the confidence that is needed, providing technical information, and to bridge the gap, the knowledge gap between players like patients and the physicians. And we also need to continue to collect data. And finally, what is the ISOP's take on biosimilars? Yes, we have set up a biosimilar task force as of last year. We aim to provide the global oncology pharmacy community with guidance to support decisions around biosimilar use. As Emma said earlier, we sent out 2 surveys. One was the needs and the implementation survey, and of course, we got interesting results. We are currently working on a global position paper to provide the global oncology pharmacy community with guidance with these products. We also, ISOP believes very strongly that education regarding the use of biosimilars is paramount to their safe and effective use. And we will be organizing a biosimilars interactive workshop at the ISOP symposium in October in London this year. So biosimilars actually are a very necessary opportunity for physicians, patients, and of course the healthcare systems, and not talking about the finances of the countries. And if properly developed and manufactured to the correct standards and used appropriately, they can positively impact the financial sustainability of healthcare systems globally. And in conclusion, the position paper by ISOO states that with potential savings, a rapidly increasing range of biologic products, and well-informed healthcare professionals and patients, biosimilars represent one of the way forward to obtaining sustainability. With growing financial constraints on healthcare systems and impending patent expiry on major biologic therapies used in oncology, biosimilars do offer an important opportunity to provide high-quality and clinically effective medications at a reduced cost, because at the end of the day, we want our patients to receive the best, safe, efficacious, and affordable treatment. These are the references, and I invite you to join us in London for our ISOP meeting from October 10 to the 13th. And thank you very much.